We're back with another episode of App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by Memberful and Pillow. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Vidici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well. We're going to talk about macOS Ventura today. But before we do that, I want to do a brief sidebar with you, Federico, about advertising in the App Store.
Okay.
Because this became a big thing last week.
And it lasted 24 hours.
It lasted 24 hours. We actually never got around to writing about it. I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I really did want to write about it. But as I explained in the pre-show for App Stories Plus listeners, I've been a little under the weather, and I've been a little busy with the Ventura review and other things that we've got going on the site. So I didn't write about this particular news item, but I have very strong feelings about it. And, just to recap, what happened was Apple did what they said they were going to do months ago now, which is they started allowing ads both in the Today tab of the App Store, as well as at the bottom of the product pages for developers' apps. What I think people, and I know at the time when that was announced, people were like, oh, they're going to junk up the store. And it turned out to be far worse than I think anybody ever anticipated, which was the store was immediately flooded by advertisements for casinos, psychics, I don't know, the
adult live chats.
Adult live chats. That's right. I saw that one too. A bunch of different things that, the seamy side of the App Store, to put it mildly. And developers were rightly upset that if you went to their page, you could go to the bottom of the page and you would see an ad for something like adult chat or a casino. And there were even apps that were, there were wellness apps that were for people who were recovering from gambling addiction and things that were having casino ads show up on their product pages, which is obviously not in line with what the app is meant to do, and a terrible thing. And I've been thinking about this a lot because the thing about Apple and its relationship with developers is that Apple very clearly believes that the customers are not the developers' customers. The customers are Apple's customers.
Right.
And that I think everybody knows. You don't have to like it, but everybody knows that that's been kind of the deal since day one. The thing, though, is that because developers don't have anywhere else to go on iOS or iPadOS, I think Apple they have an obligation to provide a space that is a good space for people to sell their stuff, not a junky space. And what happened was this immediately became like a bad, like a flea market, a junky website, basically, where you would have you have these terrible ads that were just right there. Now, I saw people saying, oh, well, nobody scrolls to the bottom anyway. It's like, that's not the point. It's like, if I was selling something that I'd worked on for months and months and was proud of and took a lot of care in both the app and the way it's presented in the release notes and the screenshots and everything, the last thing I would want to have is some kind of junky app advertised right next to it. And it's not like they have a choice. That's the thing that really gets me at the end of the day. It's not like the developers can say, well, I don't like this, I'm going to go somewhere else to sell my app, because they can't. They're stuck with Apple's App Store. And that's why I think Apple is really duty bound to do right by developers, and that this was an absolute disaster. Now, Apple has, I guess they have temporarily at least, backpedaled. They said that they
have paused.
They have paused gambling and some other categories of apps, which, all right. I mean,
whatever that means.
I don't know what they expected to happen here, Federico. This to me is super disappointing, because it's like,
I feel the same way. Like, what did you expect the outcome was going to be? Like, those are the very apps that are making extreme amounts of money for Apple on the App Store, and they're the ones with the money to do the advertising, and they're all very advertising driven to begin with. Anybody who works at the App Store, I'm sure, has long lists of metrics to understand who is buying ads and who is likely to buy ads once you have them available in this environment. I feel like this is a super easily avoided problem that someone didn't have their eye on, because it just seems like the obvious outcome
of opening up these kind of advertisements. And I don't think that there's a way to fix it other than to just tell certain categories of apps that can't advertise. And I don't know if Apple's willing to do that.
Yeah, I agree. It feels like it was... I kind of feel like maybe Apple PR got caught by surprise over this. Like, it feels like a business decision that was made in a department that possibly doesn't even talk to the App Store team. Like, I would imagine that the App Store team is like, well, we were told to start showing ads.
Yeah.
And it's one of those weird things where multiple teams at Apple do not necessarily communicate well with each other. And suddenly, if you are Apple PR, you end up with all these tweets going viral, and all these articles and blog posts all complaining about this thing. And you're like, well, what is this? Like, it feels like a bit of a thing that was mismanaged. And overall, it kind of feels like Apple is not really having a good week.
No, they aren't.
As we are recording this in between, the release of Stage Manager and all the, the universal criticism that I've seen across not just MacStories, but all kinds of other tech publications. The weird iPad lineup that they released. And then this ad-related thing. It's been a busy week at Apple PR, I think.
And there are other App Store guidelines that came out that we haven't even talked about that I think some people are upset about, or dealing with other things like boosts for social channels being subject to 30% now, and there's an NFT rule now, and all kinds of stuff that's going on that's got everybody in every camp upset about something.
Yes.
But the one thing that I think is a truism of the internet is that if you allow programmatic ads to be displayed somewhere, you're going to get the worst possible ads. And Apple has just proved that again, I think,
Yeah, I think that's right. If you're going to open up ads to all kinds of companies, the companies with the most money are usually the companies with the worst ads. And that's usually like a recipe for disaster. So
all right, well, that's enough about that. Let's talk about macOS Ventura.
Okay, so you wrote this very well done review. Congrats for getting that out in time. There's some context on the behind the scenes of the review in MacStories Plus, so if you're interested in that, make sure to check out the longer ad-free version of MacStories. So one of your themes from the review, which I really enjoyed, is how Ventura fits in the in this sort of history of modern macOS. And one of the themes that you've been covering for the past few years is Apple creating this continuum between iPad and Mac by making sure that the two of them can be on equal footing, right? And that they have the same features, or if not the same features, at the very least, a very high degree of consistency between them.
Right. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Memberful. Memberful is the easiest way to sell memberships to your audience, used by the biggest creators on the web. Memberful handles all of the hard stuff, so you can focus on what you do best while earning revenue quickly. If you're looking to add membership to your existing business, you want a solution that works with your existing technology, so you can launch a new revenue stream without rebuilding your entire tech stack. That's exactly what we did at MacStories. We launched Club MacStories years ago now, and we went with Memberful, and we've been with them ever since, because it's just so easy and integrates so well with your existing services and products and technologies that you use. For example, Memberful integrates with tools like WordPress, MailChimp, Discord, and a whole lot more. We use it in particular with both MailChimp and Discord, and it works seamlessly. Memberful maintains a full-featured GraphQL API, webhooks, and OAuth single sign-on to make it easy to integrate seamlessly with any stack, and it maintains a best-in-class WordPress plugin to add membership and content restriction to your website. You can also use custom domains, so everything is fully branded under your name. Again, something we do at MacStories. And of course, Memberful connects directly with Stripe for secure payments, and it handles all of your transactional email. Memberful has everything you need to run a membership program, including custom branding, gift subscriptions, Apple Pay, free and paid trials, private podcasts, in-house newsletters, referrals, and tons more. Memberful seamlessly integrates with the tools that you're already using. You have full control and ownership over your audience, your brand, and your membership. Get started for free today with no credit card required at memberful.com/appstories. Again, that URL is memberful.com/appstories. Our thanks to Memberful for their support of the show.
And one of the first aspects that you focused on in your review has been Stage Manager. And Stage Manager as sort of this feature that encapsulates this idea of having a consistent but different experience for multitasking, a brand new multitasking paradigm on both iPadOS and macOS. And you said you love Stage Manager, but that it's a complicated kind of love. And I wanted you to go a little bit in depth on that idea here.
Yeah, it's okay. So for context on this, one of the things that excites me about Stage Manager is because I think it does fit very neatly into this realignment between macOS and iPadOS, because we, over the past 4 years almost now, starting back with Catalina, we've seen technologies like Mac Catalyst and Swift UI and all kinds of things introduced that are making it finally easier for people coming from the iPad side of the world to bring their apps to Mac. And I have seen that in the apps that I'm sent by developers. I'm getting far more Mac apps now than I have maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So we've got things like that. We've got the system apps now in lockstep for the most part across various systems where they're getting the same features and updates every year, which was never true in the past. I mean, there were times where we waited years for things like Maps to be updated on the Mac, for instance, and all kinds of other, I guess the other big pillar of that is design, where we saw with Big Sur a shift in the design on the Mac and shifts over on the iPad side as well, to not make them the same, but to give them a kind of a cohesiveness where it's easier now, I think, if you're someone coming from the iPad to go to the Mac, but also from the Mac to the iPad. And I think it's particularly important in the iPad to Mac direction, because I feel like there's that, as I say in the post, the continuum that starts with the iPhone, which is the biggest product that Apple sells. And the reality today is that there are kids growing up who will, for years, if not in almost a decade probably, use a mobile device before they ever touch a computer. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If they're kids who are, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old right now, they're using their parents' hand-me-down iPhones or iPads or, Android phones or whatever it is. They're not, getting Chromebooks in kindergarten, right, or MacBooks. And so it's really in that's what I mean by it's a mobile-first world, in that people's computing lives, not yours or mine, but most people's today, is starting on mobile and moving to the desktop. And so there needs to be, I think, some kind of consistency there. And one place where there wasn't consistency yet, at least as between the iPad and the Mac, is in how you control the apps that you use. Split view and slide over on iPad, or one app at a time, is a very different paradigm than anything on the Mac. But with Stage Manager, you have a system that, while it does work a little differently on each system, it works close enough that it would be very comfortable if you were using it on the iPad and liked it there, to move over to the Mac and understand how to use it there. So I feel like this is kind of the final piece of the puzzle to kind of align these two systems. And I don't think they've done a real good job with it for a variety of reasons. One, you've documented quite well, which is the iPad version is in rough shape. Yeah. And I think that that's problematic from the Mac standpoint, because if it is meant to be a bridge to the Mac, it's not serving as a very good one. But on the Mac side, it is much better. And I do kind of love it. I mean, I also knew that when I told people that I love Stage Manager, I was going to get a lot of flack for it. But I don't think in the end I have gotten as much flack for it, at least from people who have read the story. Because, as I said, it's complicated. And first of all, I absolutely love the idea of Stage Manager because historically, I am a person who uses no more than a couple of apps at a time. But I use a lot of different apps throughout my day. And that means that at some point during the day, I'm going to have maybe a dozen different apps open, all with their own windows. And it's just a big mess. And I'm not a fan of managing that mess. I don't like to deal with it. And what Stage Manager does for me is it allows me to focus on one thing at a time and then switch over in the strip to something else. It's a lot like Spaces without having to do all the swiping or forgetting that you have the space open in the first place. It's to me, it's like a combination of Spaces and the action up in the menu for hide others, where you can hide all your other windows if you're working on something. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit like a combo of those things. And so I like the fact that I only see a window or two at a time and that my desktop icons are hidden. It kind of creates a nice, clean, easier to look at and easier to focus on environment. And that's what I love about it. What I don't love about it is very similar to some of the things that you describe in your design section.
Yeah.
Which is, it's just way too hard to set these things, the sets up, because it's a one window at a time focus. That the starting point and the design premise of Stage Manager is that most of the time, all you want to do is open one app at a time and have one app at a time visible. But it allows you to then drag things over from the strip into that stage and have, on the Mac, you can have as many open as you want, unlike the iPad. And I get that. I think that I understand that philosophy from the iPad standpoint. I don't agree with it from the iPad standpoint. But I understand that from a historical context, the iPad started as a one app at a time system, and that perhaps that should be the starting point if that's what people expect on the iPad. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I understand where that's coming from. On the Mac, it's a whole different story. That's never been the case, and I think it's a bad idea. I mean, there is no way to get an app onto the stage other than dragging it out of the strip or shift clicking on it in the strip. Those are the two ways. You've got other things you can do on the iPad, but you cannot, hold down any kind of modifier key and click on an app in your dock or in the Finder. There's no keyboard shortcuts to control anything, whether it's turning on Stage Manager in the first place or adding to a stage. There's no shortcuts integration. Those things, I think, all absolutely need to exist for people like me who want to use this as a way of switching between workspaces. And I'm not talking about something super complicated. I'm talking about being able to have Mail open next to the Notes app so that I can be reading an email that somebody sent me and copy and pasting information out into a note, or having Safari open next to Obsidian while I'm writing, just super simple stuff like that. And it's too hard to set up. And I think that is where the system falls down right now.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, what kind of user do you think Stage Manager on the Mac was designed for?
It's a good question.
Because obviously on iPad OS, I think it's easier to understand the perspective because you never had a windowing system before.
Right.
And so I would imagine that a conversation inside Apple may have gone something like this. Our users are asking us to use more apps at the same time on iPad OS. We think, obviously, Apple seems to historically dislike tiling systems. So they must have said, well, we're not going to do a tiling system because we don't like those. We think the solution is windowing. But what if we were to reimagine how you manage and open windows? And the answer is something along the lines of Stage Manager, right? Now, obviously, there are many conceptual problems with that, but it's easier on iPadOS. It's more clear-cut because you never had a precedent on the platform before. But on macOS, as you mentioned in your review, you don't have to use Stage Manager to enjoy windowing because you have plenty of other systems already. So my question is, who's the kind of user who thinks, well, you know what, I'm not going to use Spaces, I'm not going to use all these other power user utilities, I'm not going to use the default way, I'm just going to embrace Stage Manager. Who's that kind of user?
I think that it's maybe two different kinds of users who may actually be the same user ultimately. And one is the iPad user, someone who is coming to the Mac from the iPad, and their historical use of the iPad is one app at a time, and that's kind of what they expect. And so they're not accustomed to having lots of layers of windows that they have to manage suddenly, and this takes care of it for them. So I think there's that person. But I also feel like I know a lot of people in my life who have used a Mac who people lose windows. They just get confused by, where did my Safari window go? And why is this thing hidden? And how do I get back to this thing that I was doing? And I think it solves that problem for those people who aren't pro users by any stretch of the imagination. They're using Safari, maybe they're logging into their work computer after hours, or they just want to check their email or Facebook or something, or they're chatting in messages with their friends, that kind of thing. People of very light use that don't have a lot of needs, but get confused by the Mac because they maybe opened up one too many things and now they're not sure what happened to them. So I think that maybe is who this is for, because those people like that probably don't fill up that strip very quickly. That strip may only, ever have depends on what size screen you have, but the 4 or 6 items that they ever need. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good point in terms of the iPad user going to a Mac and finding a familiar environment. I think that's a very good point.
Yeah. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I really don't. But the problem I have is not scaling gracefully to someone who has greater needs. And I think the problem from my standpoint, and I'm not even talking about power user needs really. I'm really just talking about someone who wants to use 2 or 3 productivity apps at a time and be able to switch between 2 or 3 sets of those things on a regular basis, which is what I want to be able to do. Mm-hmm. And I do, I don't like when people say, I wonder if anybody in Apple ever used this, because of course people in Apple use these things, but I do wonder.
Yeah, I said that thing about the iPad version.
Yeah, I know you did. I know. Well, and Federico, to be fair, I have said it too. I said it in my Mac review, and it comes from a place of frustration because you realize that you're using something and you think to yourself, it can't be that someone is using this and doesn't see this problem, because this is a big problem. And with Stage Manager, the problem is the thing that I call the Stage Manager dance, where you open I'm in Obsidian and I'm writing. I'm like, oh, I need to look at something in Safari. So I open up Safari, and now all of a sudden Obsidian's gone because now it's in the strip and Safari's open. And if I want to then have the two side by side, I have to drag in.
You got to do
Obsidian,
a little dance.
Right? I got to do that every single time. And that gets really frustrating. It gets even worse when you're dealing with apps that have open dialogues like Pages, because as I know I've described on the show before, the open dialogue comes up, which takes whatever was already on your screen over to the strip. You click on whatever document you want. It closes the dialogue, but then, because there's nothing on the stage at that point, which is a no-no. Stage Manager doesn't like there cannot be an empty stage. So whatever had been on your desktop swoops back in for a split second before the document you had clicked on opens. But when it opens, it then swoops back into the strip. And now you have to then drag it back in manually to have it with the thing you just opened. So it's like it's over caffeinated. It's hyper,
caffeinated.
It's hyperactive. It's like, it's very distracting and gets you out of the flow of whatever you're doing. And I don't like it, but there it is. And that's where I said, I can't believe someone's using this and just tolerates this.
Yeah. And the animations are animations, they took a while, and Apple is very proud of their 3D thing. But like, after months of seeing that dance, it's like, oh God, I get it. You like to swoop in and animate and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not a bug, right? Because it's not a bug because the open dialogue is actually part of a different app. It's part of Finder, I think, technically. And so it's doing what Stage Manager was designed to do. So in that sense, it's not a bug, but it's an edge case that should be dealt with. It's a situation where the default behavior of Stage Manager needs to be modified, I think. I had another one that was really interesting that I didn't even realize, is that when a FaceTime call comes in, like if you have your phone ring on your Mac, the alert for FaceTime, I was typing in Obsidian one day and a phone call came in, and all of a sudden Obsidian just went away as I was typing because a FaceTime call came in. And the alert for the FaceTime call came in on my Mac and cleared my screen. And it's like, well, that's not good. It was a spam call. I didn't want to even answer the call. But to get Obsidian back, I had to, decline the call first. Yeah. So that's my thing with Stage Manager. So yes, I do love it. I do love working in it. And when it's working well, I think it works really well. And I think you've had some good experiences with it too, despite the bugs and some complaints about the way it's designed. But and I think there's a lot of potential here. And I think and what I worry about is that the way it's been designed, both on the iPad and the Mac, are going to cause people to try it and say, nope, not for me, and turn it off and never come back. Yeah. Because it's a mode, not a default. And I've seen a lot of people say, oh yeah, I tried it. And yep, those guys are right. It's not that good. And I'm
that's my concern too. Let me wrap up this section before we talk about apps and other things. Well, I want to talk about settings in Ventura. But before we do that, let me ask you, what do you think is going to happen on the macOS side short term?
Short term, I hope that they do clean up that dance a little bit and dial it back a little bit. I do think that ultimately we will get things like keyboard shortcuts. I'm not as optimistic about shortcuts. I'm not really sure that that's a priority because I don't think this is a feature that necessarily Apple feels is for people who use shortcuts. If you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then it may be a while. But my dream with shortcuts and Stage Manager is to be able to have a morning shortcut where I run it when I sit down at my desk. It cleans up whatever mess I left the day before, sets up 2 or 3 stages, and they're right there waiting for me in the sidebar for me to flip between without having to do any of the kind of that cleanup or management myself.
Mm-hmm. Well, all right. That's a very, very, very good conversation about Stage Manager.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pillow. More and more studies show that getting a good night's sleep is beneficial to your health and well-being. Pillow is a simple app that makes you more aware of your sleep patterns and helps you make informed decisions that lead to better sleep quality. All you have to do is wear your Apple Watch while you sleep. Pillow will track and analyze your sleep patterns automatically and give you a full report in the morning. If you want to use Pillow with just an iPhone or an iPad, you can do that with the press of a button. But the Apple Watch also gives you important information about your heart rate trends, variability, heart rate dip, and blood oxygen levels for each sleep session. You can even record sounds like sleep talking, sleep apnea, snoring, and other noises that might be disrupting your sleep. If your Apple Watch is a Series 6 or newer, Pillow will display information about the intensity of those sounds during each sleep session with a rating of the exposure. Another valuable aspect of Pillow is helping you make informed decisions about your sleep. Pillow comes with a dedicated section where you can discover trends, get personalized insights, sleep tips, and easily compare your sleep metrics with your weight, steps, caffeine consumption, and other health metrics. If you want to wind down and relax before going to bed, or listen to something throughout the night, Pillow comes with an expanding collection of sleep aid sounds, guided meditations, bedtime stories, and music produced specifically for sleep. If you have a chance to take a nap during the day, Pillow has a power nap mode too. When it's time to wake up, Pillow can wake you up using your iPhone, Apple Watch, or iPad at the lightest possible sleep stage. And starting with watchOS 6, Pillow's battery consumption is minimal too. Last but not least, Pillow is very privacy-minded. All of your sleep and audio data are encrypted and stored on your device and in your iCloud storage account using end-to-end encryption. You don't need to register or create an account to use Pillow. You can use it anonymously, and it doesn't collect or send your personal data anywhere else. Pillow is free to use and download from the App Store and comes with a set of great features that you can use every day for free. But if you want to try its premium features, there's also an option to start a 7-day free trial. Just visit pillow.app to get started today and to learn more. Again, that URL is pillow.app. Our thanks to Pillow for their support of the show.
Another, obviously in your review, you talk about a bunch of apps. I'm going to save those for later. But you also focus on settings, on the new system settings app in Ventura. And I got to say, as an iPad user, largely iPad first user, when I saw that Apple was bringing an iPad-inspired settings app to macOS, replacing the old system preferences, I was very happy because that has always been a friction point for me in terms of going from one device to the other. Just like you were saying about multitasking and Stage Manager, finding a consistent experience when moving between platforms, I think that's the more beneficial approach for people like me. However, system settings on Ventura, very strange application. Both in terms of the actual app itself, it's a window that you cannot make any larger, you can only make it taller.
Right.
And it seems to me as if Apple took all the problems from system preferences, and it's not like they really fixed them, they shuffled them around. So you have the same problems but in different places. And then I gotta say, while it is consistent in terms of you have a sidebar, like on iPadOS, at least for me, it doesn't make it really easy to find things. And
no, I think it's harder. Yeah, I think it's harder overall.
Yeah. So, what do you think of what Apple has done here?
Well, I think the idea is correct. I think the approach is wrong.
Which is also funny because there are some parallels there with Stage Manager, right? You could say that the idea is right, but it's the execution that maybe leaves much to be desired.
Yeah, and this is one of the very big picture things that flows throughout the review, which is I feel like Apple did a far better job in Catalina, Big Sur, Monterey, some of these other releases of harmonizing the iPad and the Mac in a way that was true to the platforms. And here they just kind of tacked on some iPad stuff that it doesn't really fit particularly well with the Mac. Now, I know there are a lot of people who will disagree with me. There are people who are very, very, very upset when I say that the design of the Mac and iPad it's a good thing that they're being harmonized. I recognize that. I'm that guy who says that. And I'm going to continue to be that guy because I think it's the right direction to go.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
But these settings are not good. And they're not good for a couple of reasons. One is first of all, they were very buggy, and they still have bugs in them. I didn't go into all the details. There's weird things. I mean, things jump around, and there's odd interactions with the way windows open and move and things like that. A lot of that's gotten a lot better. You should have seen this thing back in June. It was unbelievable. And it's gotten a lot better in that sense. But the problem is that they just plopped in the iPad settings in a lot of ways. And as you said, you can't resize this window horizontally. I think that is a factor of wanting to be like the iPad because of the way the window is laid out, that if you made it wider, it would at times be difficult to visually track the setting you were using and the toggle that was on the far right side of the window. That to me is a design problem that would be solved by not slavishly adhering to the iPad's layout because the iPad, after all, the screen is only so big. It's not as big an issue there, but it is an issue if you have a 27-inch display or maybe, a huge 32-inch monitor. Mm-hmm. Another big problem is that the iPad settings aren't great to begin with. I mean, I'm not sure why. I guess I get it in that you don't want to break people's muscle memory, and you're going to do that with the Mac anyway, so why do it with the iPad too? But the reality is I feel like settings on the iPhone and the iPad are fine, but they're not great. It's hard to find things there too. And I feel like settings maybe should have gotten a redesign from the ground up across all the platforms at once. Just rip that Band-Aid off, try to come up with something that's consistent as possible between the platforms and makes more sense, because the reality is settings get added every single year to these OSs, and they get fit in. It might have made sense in 2019 to add a setting in one place, but in 2022, it doesn't make so much sense there anymore. But it doesn't get moved because it's not a priority or whatever. And as a result, I think that the settings are a little messy on iPad to begin with, and when you bring that over to the Mac, it just brings the mess to the Mac as well. I think that they can make them better. It is at least nice that search works well. I really encourage people to use search because, I mean, I did that episode on MacStories with Jason earlier in the summer, and right before we started, I had been trying to find the setting for how long it takes for your Mac for the wallpaper or the screensaver to kick in.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, it's not in the desktop section. It's not in the wallpaper section. It's in something called lock screen. And I'm not sure why the Mac has a setting called lock screen. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me. And it's just one example of a setting that's in a weird place that I know where it is now and I'll find it again, but it's not where I would expect it to be. I think that they did, though, after we had that conversation there, I think if I remember right, there's a button that's been added to the desktop section that will take you over to that. So there's some cross-referencing going on from setting to setting, which helps and things. But yeah, I don't get super exercised about settings because it's just settings and the search works pretty well. But it is a disappointing design choice because I think Apple has historically done really well at adapting some of these things from other systems onto the Mac and vice versa. And here they just kind of dropped the ball on that approach.
Yeah. There's already like plenty of mock-ups and redesigns floating around on Twitter. It seems to me like this is one of the areas where Apple is gonna tweak this new design a lot over the next year, because it's clearly it seems very much unfinished to me. Is sort of the sense that I get from system settings.
I mean, system preferences had to go. I'm not suggesting that we should have stuck with what we had. It was well past its lifespan and needed to go, but what we got wasn't any better.
Yeah. So I want to talk about apps now. Obviously, you covered all the all the things that we covered earlier in the summer, and that I also covered in my iOS 16 review. The changes to Notes, so you have more filters for smart folders. Which is, now that things are settling down, this is one of the areas where I want to spend more time playing around with, because I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of what you can do now in Notes. Changes to reminders, changes to Mail. You wrote about Mail a couple of months ago. You wrote about iCloud Shared Photo Library, which is also a feature now, and it's available in Ventura, in the Photos app. You did an excellent job rounding up all these changes. But there's one app in particular where you didn't maybe see all the changes that you were hoping for. This is also one of the things you mentioned many, many times this year on MacStories and on MacStories, which is shortcuts. And you were spot on, I think, was it last year, few months ago, where you had this article, this story, in which you argued that you were concerned that having the scripting actions in shortcuts for Mac. So running AppleScript, running JavaScript, running terminal commands, while super useful for power users, you were concerned that maybe Apple could have used those actions as an excuse not to bring new native actions to shortcuts for Mac. And I'm afraid that Ventura shows you may have been right there.
Yeah, at least so far I'm right.
At least so far.
I hope that changes. But, when Shortcuts was introduced on the Mac, they brought over the most popular automator actions. And that was great because I don't know that people really expected that right out of the box. And that covered a lot of ground for system stuff. But, the Mac is an old and versatile OS, and there are a lot of things you could do with system actions that Shortcuts doesn't do. Now, you can do a lot of those things with AppleScript or the terminal or whatever, but the idea is that Shortcuts is supposed to be the future of automation on the Mac, or at least that's what Apple tells us. And if that's the case, I really do think that stuff has to start coming to the Mac, and we got none of that this year. We didn't even get parity on an app-by-app basis, which really bothers me because that's one of the things that I think that this process over the last few years that's become a really big advantage for Mac users is the parity with changes made to things like notes and reminders year over year on all platforms. And that parity is important, but it's not being carried over to Shortcuts, not everywhere at least. I think Notes is a very notable exception because it had a lot of new Shortcuts actions this year, and they got to the Mac too. But, a lot of the Safari stuff with tab groups and everything, that's not on the Mac in Shortcuts, which makes using Shortcuts across multiple platforms difficult. And you add to that, on top of that, the lack of Shortcuts actions for system apps, and it's just really disappointing. I mean, I do find myself using scripting a fair amount for things. It's probably, as I said in the review, the scripts tend to be shorter. They don't tend to be as extensive as maybe I would have had to do in Automator. But to me, in a way, that just furthers my point in that if all I have to do is a couple of different lines of AppleScript to make something happen, shouldn't that be a native action instead of an AppleScript that I have to reference? And so, yeah, it's definitely disappointing. I hope, I think it's understandable given the problems that Shortcuts had last year, that the focus was probably on fixing bugs more than extending the system. But, definitely looking for some more changes there.
Yeah. And I can imagine that the Shortcuts team, more than building new actions, I think the main problem is that they maybe spent the past year fixing and polishing up the Swift UI foundation that they released last year to much criticism from the community. The one thing I want to say that I'm happy to see in Ventura that you also covered in your review is some Safari actions made it over to macOS, and there's now a proper share sheet in Ventura, which you don't like the share sheet, I think, but at the very least you can run Shortcuts from the share sheet.
Yeah, that's not Shortcuts' fault. I mean, they changed the share menu on the system, but at least Shortcuts is in there.
Yeah. So overall, I mean, once again, congrats, John, for finishing up your review. It's adding to your list of annual macOS reviews. I think we're living in an interesting time in terms of Apple software, because I've been thinking about this, and I kind of feel like there has been basically universal praise for the iPhone, for the hardware, for the dynamic island, for live activities. I think Apple really nailed the implementation of iOS. And it feels to me like as if there's this disconnect in between what Apple is doing in terms of iOS and what they're doing on macOS and iPadOS. And I'm putting those two together because they are more related than ever. So I'm curious to see basically what I'm saying is I would love to see the same praise and the same level of excitement. And maybe it's impossible, but one can hope. But I would like to see those same reactions, that you see from people on Twitter, from websites about the dynamic island and iOS, but for macOS and iPadOS. Like, I would love to see that excitement again. Maybe it'll happen, maybe not, but for sure, Apple, for the next few months, I think they have a lot of work to do. So at least they'll be keeping busy.
Yeah, they will. They will. All right, Federico, that's a good place to stop since I'm losing my voice. Thanks, everybody, for reading my review this year. I want to thank our two sponsors for this episode. That's Memberful and Pillow. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is at Fetici on Twitter and Instagram. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.